how much power do we really have to influence people, to change people through intent of prayer, like intention prayer, and how much of it is just changing our perception?
Well, I don't think there's anything been invented yet to calibrate the power of prayer or the influence on the invisible world of good intentions. I think it's a matter of experience and faith. It seems that we can say that evolution advances pretty much under three aspects. One is divine providence, and the other is human free will, and the third is chance. So that means we can't attribute to God a priori anything that happens, because it might have been us or somebody else who set these things in motion. And God seems to respect the nature of every creature and lets them work things out. And this is one of the miracles, that this incredible planet and universe keeps going with such diversity, and it gets along fairly well. I mean, it could be worse. But God could interfere. Now suppose, and this is what at least Scripture presupposes, that our prayers really contribute to the healing of human misery, of a spiritual order, and perhaps also of a physical order. But not necessarily on every occasion. Sometimes one of those other factors, chance, enters in, or some other human intervention. So we have to realize that God is in charge, but with the marvelous finesse and respect for the nature of every creature, he lets things work themselves out, and that's how evolution takes place in that category. So perhaps the best answer to your question would be that when we are really sincerely praying to God and have not abandoned ourselves simply to our own demands or efforts to control God in some way, then it isn't so much us but the Holy Spirit that is praying in us, especially if you acknowledge this principle of oneness, or that there is no other. When you become the other, that is, when God is living and acting in you, everything changes in your perspective on life and Scripture and nature and ecology, and other people are sort of penetrated and soaked in this sense that everything has a basic oneness, and that we're called to contribute to it in some way, one of which is prayer, which for some people is all they can do, especially if they're invalids or something. And only God can judge the power of prayer. And what he's really listening to is the Spirit in us that is groaning with ineffable groans, according to St. Paul. What's he groaning about? The delays in the transformation of the human family, that seems to be the divine goal, to change matter itself into the divine, that which is farthest from God into what is closest, in order to manifest his total detachment from any possessive attitude, and his desire to host us to the point of giving himself. No other host does that. To give you not only gifts, but their total being. And this is what I mean by the universe's primary meaning as sacrifice, the total gift of one's own identity or self, or all that one is or has, out of love. Because this is what God is doing all the time. So naturally, the Spirit dwelling in us is doing the same thing insofar as he can get a hearing, which is a long distance.
I was wondering, with regard to the power of forgiveness to transform and to heal, and I mean forgiveness in the sense of being forgiving versus the notion of an action.
I mean, I would say the other way, if one isn't forgiving, then one sets oneself up in judgment. Because, is that right? If you don't, I mean, you only forgive because either something has been done to you or somebody else which you feel is wrong. And the little I have in my own experience is that we don't really know very often what's really right or wrong. You know, there is this infinite wisdom in life that gives us these experiences. Somebody I knew who was very wise said there are no such thing as good or bad experiences, there are only experiences. And yet, sometimes the most painful things that happen to us that appear to be the most unjust take us to places inside of ourselves we wouldn't otherwise go. And so, in a way, you have to, if you follow the whole experience right through, then in my experience it takes you to a place in the heart where the heart can then open, and maybe if there is need, forgiveness comes from the heart. It doesn't come from the mind, it doesn't come from the ego. If there is something to forgive, if there is a real injustice that has been done to you. But, as I say, there is a Sufi saying that says, everything is sweet if you taste it with care. And which means you kind of allow it to happen to you. If you can be that vulnerable and that exposed, and maybe have a certain humility that doesn't know what is right or what is wrong. But and then I think, I do remember we had somebody in our group who had terrible experiences as a child, you know, and that really determined so much of her life. And she came to our group, and there was, after sitting there, you know, for quite a number of years and just being in meditation and just being with that, then something in her forgave. She said, I can't forgive, but something in her forgave what had happened to her. And that I respected.
Psychologically, the real person that has to forgive us is, of course, ourselves. And so, if we have ideas of how we should perform or measure up, or feel that we've failed in any way, our ideals or our self-image or our idealized self-image, then we're liable to project on others the pain of not being able to forgive ourselves, and so we find it hard to forgive others. And so the sense of being forgiven by God is perhaps one of the best ways of being able to forgive ourselves. One almost wonders whether it's possible to forgive ourselves unless we feel forgiven by God. But of course people differ in their reactions. It's a very deep mystery, and it deserves a good deal of prayer and thought. But the main motive for forgiving everyone is the fact that we're constantly receiving it for our misdeeds or our failures. I would think that most important place to start with forgiveness is to have compassion on oneself. It's not the end of the journey, but perhaps the beginning. And not to be surprised by our faults, and to have even a certain amusement at what difficulties we get ourselves in. It's pride that doesn't want to make a mistake or be humbled or fail or something. So I think God encourages us to forgive others as a way of inviting us to realize that there are many reasons why we feel powerless. Some of it is the fact that we're still quite unevolved from our vegetative and animal sources. Our ancestors, if you go back far enough. And to be able to let go of our past, to give it to God, enables one to feel at ease in not judging anyone else, and even to feel compassion for the things that are done against us, rather than react with revenge or anger, which is the animal way of reacting. In other words, the problem is much bigger than a particular practice. It's the whole context of the human condition, in which we're evolving and have not integrated the animal instincts that we brought with us in our evolving process. And that God is fully aware of this and isn't expecting us to be suddenly perfect, or perfect in our ideas.
I would like both of you to speak about the practice of atonement and contrition.
Have you some
Yeah, I
words
mean,
on it?
I think it's very important, atonement and contrition. It's really taking responsibility for oneself in this life. It isn't penance. Penance is something that you kind of do to yourself. Yes, there can be penance if you make a really bad mistake. You can have to pay penance for it. But atonement has to do with the soul's relationship to God, as far as I understand, and which has to do with the spiritual connection one soul has to God. And there is a certain, if you make a mistake, and because we are human, we make mistakes, some mistakes require an act of contrition. It's a certain inner purification that is really taking responsibility for what one has done in a spiritual sense. Somebody asked about forgiveness before, but to me, contrition has a deeper spiritual sense, and one becomes contrite before God, which is a certain inner purification. At least that's how it is.
Yes, I agree. Yeah. The only thing I might suggest as to keep in mind at the same time is that as soon as you make an act of contrition, that's the end of it. And so guilt feelings that last more than 10 seconds are neurotic.
I wondered if I could bring you back to the notion of sacrifice in the Christian tradition, going back to the Hebrew Bible and then the Christian Bible, and how it connects to centering prayer and letting go of our false selves.
Well, that's a fairly comprehensive subject. But it's nice. I like to see broad vistas. What does sacrifice actually mean? It's pretty generally understood to mean the gift of oneself, don't you think? Whoever the self might be. Well, So the Christian concept of sacrifice is rooted in the Trinitarian relationships in which the Father, that is the original source of the divine Godhead, and who is emptiness itself, in the sense of being all possibilities. Now, in God, knowledge is in being the other. So the only way he can know the Son is to be the Son, and this he does by giving himself totally away to the Son, at least in the Trinitarian theologies that have been developed over the centuries. And the Son, in turn, is related to the Godhead as receiving it, and he returns all that he has received to the Father. And so you have this, what is called circumcision, in which each of the relationships of the Trinity live in the other rather than in themselves. But the easiest thing to understand is that we're talking about total surrender of the entire Godhead with all its riches and with all that it is, whatever that is, without our in any way pretending to know in the least degree what that is. It just is wonderful, and it's perfect happiness, and in the Trinity there is no possessiveness. There is simply gift, gift, gift. So sacrifice then in the Trinity is beatitude. It's the delight of love, of giving itself away and of being the other, to the extent in which, of course, the Trinity is no other. It's just all in all. And so now if the Trinity then creates, and especially if it creates beings who have some degree of freedom, such as angels and people, then you have a situation in which you cannot have complete sacrifice or gift of self. In other words, the false self is notable for being the center of its own universe. It's not interested normally in giving itself away, but rather in seeking various forms of perpetuating itself, of being the center of attention, and of having power over others. So what we're invited to do then in receiving the divine life is to imitate what is going on eternally in the Trinity, which is to give ourselves back to the source, to the Father. And this involves sacrifice for us that is painful. It should be a delight, and no doubt it will be in heaven. But on this earth, it's painful because we're attached to this ego and false self, or our shadow side. We know no other self, and so we hang on to it for dear life. And so there are other aspects to sacrifice that have come into being in order to respond to this broad spectrum of what is involved, or to try to be able to offer substitute sacrifices for ourselves. And this is one of the ideas that is a favored one in some theologies, in which the idea of redemption is that God sacrificed himself in the person of Jesus for us, in order that we might be able, in our own way, to sacrifice ourselves in due time. So perhaps that's all I can say about it, without going into other aspects of it at this time. But it does mean that when you undertake the spiritual journey, you're entering into this dynamic of self-sacrifice, of giving oneself to God, and some form of contemplative prayer, like centering prayer. It's a deliberate assimilation or commitment to this process just by sitting down. The gesture itself is the gift of oneself to God, without knowing who one exactly is yet, or who God is. So it's a movement of faith into the mystery of redemption, liberation from the false self, and resurrection of the true self, and what is more, ascension to the bosom of the Father into what might be called unity consciousness. And that's the area that we're talking about when we speak of there is no other. God is all in all, which is the ultimate triumph of the mystery of sacrifice, self-giving becoming God's gift to us of God's self.
I have in my almost 70 years of life still not overcome my ridiculous desire to be right. And
To what?
to be right.
To be right.
Right.
Right?
To avoid, to not be wrong.
To not be wrong.
And I have the feeling I'm not alone. I see it all around in the presidential candidates, in world politics. And I would love to understand, because this too is beyond reason. There's nothing in it to be right. And I'm the only one who is interested in it. The other wants to be right too. And it splits. It creates distance. It's a place of no love and not of oneness. And I wonder how, I know that I have this eager German desire to be right, and I truly want to overcome it. And the related question is to how can I learn to be wrong and relax and maybe even enjoy it?
I mean, we're always wrong. I mean, once you have a relationship with God, you're always wrong, because you don't know what it's about. You know this image. How can the frog understand the ocean? You know, once you make a relationship with God, you have no idea what's going on, and you're going to be wrong because you don't know what it's about, and that is humility. There's a whole spiritual teaching in learning how to fail, and somehow in this culture we've forgotten that. And in my spiritual path, one just failed and failed and failed, because that's how it is. There is nothing to succeed. There is nobody to be right. And one is wrong. And then eventually you give up. Because the ego is always wrong. The very nature of the ego is it's wrong. Because it's an illusion. How can, it's wrong. It is the veil. It is the obstacle. You are what separates you from God. So once you admit that you're wrong, and you're always wrong, then, but that's just my feeling.
But once in a while you might be right.
That's like the bonus in the cornflake package,
At least you're right in thinking you're always wrong.
Yeah, there you go.
But may I add something
Please,
to
absolutely,
your...
sure.
I'd like to suggest that this is a great affliction you suffer from. And lots of people have it, and I have had it, certainly, not so much lately, but I certainly know what you're talking about. It's so nice to be right. But it's really rooted in our security needs, because to be right is one of the greatest sources of security there is, especially to be right about having the right religion. Nothing gives you more pleasure than the certitude that you're on the right track and that you're on the right side of God and you're in the right religion and on the right meditation, etc. So insofar as you're trying to dismantle the emotional programs, such as security, it's good to remind yourself, it might be helpful, that you don't have to be right. What a relief that would be. Give yourself permission not to be right. Because if you are right and have that attachment, it just feeds into your security system and makes it more difficult to be at peace when you're wrong. So you'll notice I've moved the issue to a psychological level. And this is what the divine therapy does. It really is a depth psychology and a kind of psychoanalysis. It brings to our attention the subtle ways in which we're attached to ourselves and that support the false self system. And so when you're upset by anything, to ask yourself, why I'm upset? You notice Jesus often asks people in the gospel, what are you afraid of? Why are you upset? Where is your faith? In other words, the thrust of the Christian path is motivation, which is really everything in the Christianity. So you can do the best actions, but it doesn't do any good if your motive is should I say it, wrong. But really, it's not a question of right or wrong. It's a question, in a sense, of an affliction, of a dis-ease, of a idea of ourselves that is still rooted in childish experiences that are not our fault, but that we haven't gotten free of yet. And that's why redemption is a liberation. It's the healing of the whole person and the traumas of all of life. And the need to be right is a classical example of a cliche from the culture that we may have interiorized as children because our parents always wanted to be right or have us always right, or some teacher or some military person. And it's turning it over to God for healing and feeling free just to be who we are with this affliction. Yes, I always want to be right, and I don't have to be. And gradually, God can take away our faults. So good luck on your journey. Thanks for bringing such an important issue to our attention. So the three of them, once again, are ignorance, not knowing where happiness can be found, concupiscence, or the Buddhists call it craving, which is the search for happiness in the wrong places through attachment, compulsion, or addiction, to add a little psychological research to the theological terminology. And finally, if one ever finds out the direction in which true happiness is, the will is too weak to pursue it. So it's a rather dim view of humanity. Happens to be the truth, however. And so the modern psychology, it seems to me, and self-help programs have only emphasized the weakness or damage that human nature has when it's over-identified with its instinctual needs or with its social group. And this can happen even to very holy people. The mythic membership level of consciousness that we all pass through at some point in our developmental processes in childhood and so on, it is so strong, no one can completely graduate from their cultural conditioning, or the unquestioned assumptions that we interiorize, that our parents or teachers or our society at large, or now the television and the internet, have been beaming towards us all our life long. So to let go of our attachment to our preconceived ideas or prepackaged values is part of the exercise of our rational faculties and moving into full human functioning. Graduating, in other words, from our childish programs for happiness that can't work in adult life.